Richard opens the play by telling the audience that now that his brother has been made king, his disfigured body has no place in peace. He cannot be the courtier, so he'll be a villain, and take that crown for himself. Richard's brother, King Edward, is sick and heard a prophecy that someone whose name starts with G would take his son's throne. Their brother Clarence, whose first name is George, is sent to prison, and Richard, of Gloucester, pretends he wants to help Clarence but actually plots to kill him. The Lady Anne is part of the funeral procession for her father-in-law, King Henry VI, and she weeps and rages against Richard for having killed Henry and her husband, Prince Edward. But Richard comes in and surprises her and says it was love for her that made him kill these people and compels her to take his ring and agree to be his wife. As soon as he has won her, he laughs to the audience, saying that he'll have her, but he won't keep her long. The Queen, Elizabeth, formerly Lady Grey, and her relatives Rivers and Grey are concerned about Richard and how he never wanted his brother to marry her. Richard comes in and spews outrage at them for their slanders about him, and the former Queen Margaret comes in and curses everyone. Richard sends murderers who kill Clarence. The King Edward tries to bring his country into good unity before his death so that his son will have a united land to rule, and he asks where his brother Clarence is, now that he's given the pardon. Richard pretends that the pardon never reached the prison in time, and Edward is distraught that he has killed his own brother. There's a whole scene of women and children lamenting the death of Clarence and Richard's rising power. Buckingham suggests to Richard that the Queen's relatives should be separated from the dying king, and Richard is so pleased he makes Buckingham his right-hand man. The king dies, and Richard and Buckingham arrest Rivers, Grey, and Vaughan, the relatives of the Queen. The women and children are again distressed by this, especially Elizabeth the Queen, who claims sanctuary for herself and her younger son, the Duke of York. Richard mocks the idea of women and children needing sanctuary and suggests the cardinal bring the Queen and her little boy to London. Richard meets his nephew, the young King Edward, in London and says all the other uncles, Rivers, Grey, Vaughan, are false friends and that he and his brother need to stay at the Tower until his coronation. Ratcliffe takes Rivers, Vaughan, and Grey to be executed for treason, ostensibly. Lord Hastings opposes the suggestion that Richard should be the one crowned, so Richard has him killed on the pretense of conspiring with the Queen, Rivers, Vaughan, and Grey, to curse Richard's hand. And they start throwing around the claim that the princes are not the legitimate sons of Edward, but the children of Lady Grey's adultery, and thus should not be considered royal. Buckingham and Catesby help Richard with a charade of religious devotion and bring the mayor of London and a group of citizens to urge Richard to take the crown. Richard pretends he doesn't want it, but takes it in the end. The former Queen and Duchess of York, Richard's mother, are not allowed into the Tower to see the princes. Lady Anne joins them in lamenting until she's summoned to join her husband in his coronation. The moment Richard is crowned king, he fears he will lose the throne. He asks Buckingham to have the princes killed, and when Buckingham hesitates at the murder of royal children, Richard bypasses him and asks Catesby to get it done. Tyrrell goes and murders the children in their beds. Richard decides that he wants a more politically advantageous wife, so he pretends Anne is sick and has her killed too. Buckingham senses he is out of favor and leaves Richard to go and join Richmond and his growing army. Margaret, Elizabeth, and the Duchess of York are all grief-stricken, mourning each other's children whom Richard has murdered. When Richard and his army come, his mother curses him to his face, but Richard then takes the opportunity to court the former Queen Elizabeth on behalf of her daughter, the young Elizabeth, and again, the mother miraculously agrees to allow her daughter to marry the man who killed her sons. Richard's subjects start fleeing to join Richmond's army, but Richard threatens them and their children if they desert. The night before the battle, the two opposing leaders dream. They are visited by all the ghosts of the men, women, and children that Richard has killed. They put curses on Richard, despair, and die, and blessings on Richmond. God and good angel fight on Richmond's side. Both leaders speak to their armies, Richmond telling of the good of England, God's glory in the death of tyrants, and Richard speaking how every person in Richmond's army is a miserable traitor vomited from England and scheming to rape their wives and daughters. And the battle breaks out. Richmond and Richard fight, and Richmond defeats him, proclaiming, "The bloody dog is dead." Richmond accepts the crown and agrees to marry young Elizabeth of York, uniting the Red Rose and the White Rose. The civil wars are over. England is united and finally at peace.